name is Carol Murphy, and I'm a professor of French and director of the Florida Research Institute at the University of Florida, one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event. It is a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the lecture by Professor Emily Apter, Professor of French and Comparative Literature at New York University, and to welcome Professor Apter to UF. She will address us shortly on her topic this evening, In-comparative literature, on the problem of untranslatability in literary studies, the fourth lecture of 14 in the 16-month speaker series, Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts, organized by Dr. Bonnie Efros, Rothman Chair and Director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere at UF. Dr. Efros will present Dr. Apter's scholarly profile to you in a few minutes, but she has asked me to say a few introductory words of welcome. This afternoon, many of us had the opportunity to attend Professor Apter's lunchtime seminar on translation issues as they relate to cultural, practical, and geopolitical strategies. The seminar was rich and thought-provoking in the ideas discussed by faculty and graduate students in attendance, but unfortunately all too brief. We are pleased to continue the conversation with Emily Apter this evening. For those of you unfamiliar with the France-Florida Research Institute, our center has been in existence since 2002 when the University of Florida was designated a Center of Excellence in French Studies by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs through the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. We are part of a network of 16 such centers in the United States, including NYU's Center for French Civilization and Culture, who sponsor lecture series, short-term visiting professorships, conferences, exhibits, film series, and outreach activities that showcase the interdisciplinarity of French and Francophone studies throughout the university. As part of our season this year, in addition to tonight's lecture, we co-sponsored the visit to campus of Professor Emeritus J. Hillis Miller, Professor of English, Comparative Literature, and Critical Theory, Center for Jewish Studies, in a series of events organized by Professor Dragan Kujundzik around the screening of his documentary film on Hillis Miller, The First Sale. In the spring, at the suggestion of Professor Brigitte Bergman-Aron, we have invited the Martinican writer Suzanne Gracius to be a short-term FFRI visiting professor at UF, where she will be a guest lecturer in 2 of our courses, Creole and French and Francophone cultures, and deliver a public lecture in French. We will partner also with Professor Ralph Remshart in the School of Theater and Dance, who is producing Bernard Cortes's play Roberto Zucco, and we will be inviting to UF members of the 7 Stages Theater Company in Atlanta, involved in a decade-long U.S. Cortes project involving translation of all of the plays. Last but not least, we'll sponsor our annual French and Francophone Film Festival at Pierre Theater in downtown Gainesville under the direction of Dr. Sylvie Marie. I want to thank especially Dr. Bonnie Efros for her efforts in this year's thoughtful, rich, and very necessary revalorization of the central importance of the humanities in the university, and for her invitation to Dr. Emily Apter to speak to the crucial role of languages and literatures in our enterprise. So without further ado, I invite Bonnie Efros to present our speaker this evening.
Good evening and welcome. I'm so glad that so many of you turned out this evening. I know we're at a very busy point in our semester, and we're always very happy to see you here. It's my great pleasure to join in welcoming you to the 3rd speaker of our series, Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts. We are especially thankful also to the France-Florida Research Institute for generously helping us to make this event possible. As many of you already know, this semester the Center opened a 18-month-long speaker series on the place of the humanities in higher education. Our aim is to create a forum with many voices in which members of the university and the community tackle historical and contemporary tensions in the intellectual life of universities and point to the way in which their relationships with surrounding communities, whether local or global, will develop in the future. Our speakers confront the consequences and implications of reduced public funding for education, growing ethnic and religious difference on university campuses, impact of globalization on education, the potentials and pitfalls of information technology on our campuses, as well as the general trend towards corporatization of higher education. Especially in the context of the current political climate in Florida, these talks seek to catalyze engaged discussion about how these changes affect the UF community and our mission as a public land-grant institution. Our speakers will thus contemplate and contextualize the hallmarks, aims, artifacts, audience, and outcomes of a liberal arts education. The ultimate goal of this series is to provide a critical reading of universities' contributions to academic advances and public life so that we can make sense of the complex issues that are integral to their current form and future evolutions. Tonight's lecture, which will address the topic of translation studies, represented a topic of special importance given the recent elimination of comparative literature and language programs at a variety of state institutions, or equally disturbing, the diminution of the functions of faculty in these fields to heavy loads of undergraduate language teaching and the removal of their responsibility for research and graduate training. Before I introduce our guest, Professor Emily Apter, this evening, I want to give brief thanks to the many different organizations that have made tonight's event possible. These include the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere's Rothman Endowment, the Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History Program, the UF Honors Program, the Alexander Brass Chair in Jewish History, the UF International Center, the UF Office of Research, the UF College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the UF Center for Jewish Studies, the UF Libraries, the UF College of Public Health and Health Professions, the UF France-Florida Research Institute, the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Endowment for Florida Archaeology, the UF Department of History, the UF Department of Classics, the African American Studies Program at UF, and the UF Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, as well as the UF College of Design, Construction, and Planning, and our community partner, the Alachua County Library District. I also want to thank Sophia Akert, Cindy Link, and Chris Benora for helping to prepare for this lecture, and those that will follow in the coming semesters. And we also have flyers out on the table here if anybody's interested. And if you hadn't noticed on your way in, we also have snacks, so please help yourself to food if you'd like, either before or after the lecture. And these are courtesy of the UF International Center and its International Education Week, which coincided with the visit of Professor Apter. After long months of planning, it's very rewarding to see events like today's come to fruition. And I'm especially pleased to be able to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Emily Apter, to Gainesville. Professor Apter did her doctoral work at Princeton and has been Professor of French and Comparative Literature at NYU since 2002. Previously, she taught French or Comparative Literature at UCLA, Cornell University, UC Davis, University of Pennsylvania, and Williams College. Professor Apter has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the ACLS, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the NEH. She's the author of multiple books, including most recently The Translation Zone, A New Comparative Literature, which came out in 2005, as well as Continental Drift, From National Characters to Virtual Subjects, Feminizing the Fetish, Psychoanalysis and Narrative Obsession in Turn of the Century France, and Andre Gide, and the Code of Homotextuality. She's also co-editor with William Peets of Fetishism as Cultural Discourse, and her current projects include a book called Papers on Technique, Literary History and Theory since 1975, an essay collection called Decadence, the Century, and she's also co-editing with Jacques Lazra and Michael Wood the English edition of Vocabulaire Européen des Philosophies, which is a Dictionary of Untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon. At NYU, she has organized 2 Humanities Council lectures series on the humanities in an era of global comparatism and also timing the political. She's initiated a series of panels at NYU's La Maison Française devoted to rethinking 19th century French studies. And since 1998, she has edited a book series at Princeton University Press called Translation, Transnation. So without further comment, and to avoid cutting further into your talk, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Professor Emily Apter, who will speak tonight on in-comparative literature on the problem of untranslatability in literary studies.
Thanks for that very generous introduction, and really general thanks to all my hosts here, Bonnie Epros, Carol Murphy for that lovely pre-introduction, Sofia Cord, and Dragan Kudrovic. How many times does your name get mispronounced? I was kind of dreading that. I was going to get away with Dragan, but I figured I'll have to try. Yeah. Who took me to see alligators today, and it was really great. So without further delay, let me get started. Oh, I have to also say that Dragan scooped my opening already at lunch. He talked about Tolstoy's War and Peace in the preface to that, and I begin with a citation, as you'll see. So he went to it like a homing pigeon. The opening paragraph of the 2007 Knopf English translation of Tolstoy's War and Peace prompts a double take. It's in French. As Richard Pevere, co-translator with Larissa Volonkonsky, notes, quote, and this is, I'll be putting a lot of the quotes on and not necessarily reading all of them to save some time, but you can follow along. The book opens in French, not with a few words of French, as in those English versions that do not eliminate the French altogether, but with a whole paragraph of French, with only a few phrases of Russian at the end. This mixing of French and Russian goes on for another 5 chapters or more. There are also passages in German as well. For all of them, Tolstoy supplied his own translations and footnotes, as we do. But that made the question still more problematic because Tolstoy's translations are occasionally inaccurate, perhaps deliberately so. The amount of French in the text is smaller than some early critics asserted, not a third, but only about 2%. But there's a great deal of Gallicized Russian, either implying that the speaker is speaking in French or showing that upper-class ladies like Julie Carrigan are unable to write correctly in their own language. So the question I raise is why this motley display of languages, which, as Pevere allows, disrupts the fictional continuum. One explanation is that it is a realist conceit showing the communication habits of Russian elite society. Its ready shifts into court and diplomacy language and ease with living in translation. Tolstoy, by this logic, was interested in the cosmopolitan interaction of languages within the world of Russian, particularly the social function of French as a language of political secrecy and subterfuge. And by commencing his novel in French, he gained admission to the precinct of the world novel. This gambit may look paradoxical: to attain greatness as a Russian novelist, write in French. But it confirms how language worlds certify the novel's non-provincialism, its bona fides as Weltliteratur, world literature. It also alludes on a more meta level to the role untranslatability plays in determining the status of the world in world literature, and that's going to be a topic I return to in sort of a number of contexts. Pevere articulates the challenges of transposing non-translated language worlds. How do you render Gallicized Russian in English, or translate Tolstoy's mistranslated German? That was the question you asked today. These are the kinds of problems I found myself confronting when I took on the task already mentioned of co-editing the English edition of this Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, Dictionnaire des intraduisibles, which we are translating as a dictionary of untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon of controversial decision, which involves taking the word European out, and we can come back to that in discussion. With over 150 contributors, 1,500 pages of French text, and a range of entries covering ancient and modern European languages, this collective work constituted a unique experiment in philosophical analysis, in global intellectual cartography. Both a history of philosophy and a massive translation exercise, the vocabulary set out to break up the sedimentation of meanings that naturally accrue to concept names. by revealing the history of mistranslation and misfired speech acts in the history of philosophical terms, it disestablished verbal monoliths and idea myths. In its attention, and sometimes confirmed them too, in its attention to the historically shifting ideologies embedded in words, and in its emphasis on linguistic encounters in actual situations, the vocabulary invited comparison with Raymond Williams's Key Words, a vocabulary of culture and society, which might be described as a kind of cherry-picked collection of English words, many of them having to do with a kind of left culture of the moment: anarchism, bureaucracy, collective, consumer, creative, and so on. Sparked by his recognition that since World War II, the word culture had gyred wildly between its, quote, tea shop use as a word for social superiority, as defined by money, class, position, and behavior, and its way of life use as both a synonym for intellectual and artistic production and an anthropological attitude toward everyday practices, Williams was especially sensitive to untranslatability within a common language. Barbara Cassin's vocabulary was like a cross between Williams's Key Words and Reinhard Koselleck's Dictionary of Political and Social Concept History. As a work coming out of France, it also harked back to Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, not because it mimicked the Encyclopédie's wildly eclectic topical juxtapositions, which included, as you may know, electricity, Africans, Machiavellianism, sex, monarchy, man, stocking, manufacture, or embellished its concept entries with extended discussions of science, craft, and technology, but because, like the Encyclopédie, it subscribed to an open-ended translational working method. It took up, though in a non-universalist mode, the charge of using an encyclopedic project to redefine philosophy and to advance philosophical thinking by what Cassin called philosophizing in languages. I think I have a quote from her. Yeah. Cassin was particularly committed to activating philosophy as a life form. Entry terms were treated neither as static nominalisms nor as universals, but as live speech acts. Opposed to the model of the dictionary as a kind of concept mausoleum, she treated words as free radicals, as words in freedom. Though the master language was French and the orientation was toward the Hellenic scholastic Enlightenment and German European traditions, there was a concern in this book to move away from European ontology and phenomenology. The idea was to replace ontological nationalism with an approach that would emphasize how a language assumes a national silhouette or personality. Accordingly, entries compared and meditated on the specific differences furnished into concepts by the languages themselves, so Basque, Catalan, French, Greek, Romanian, Danish, Finnish, Classical Greek, Latin, German, English, Spanish, Hungarian, and Polish. Though ideally the vocabulary would have had a companion volume covering Asian, African, Indian, and Middle Eastern languages, and as I said at lunch today, I hope someday it will, or in the form of a kind of wiki, it succeeded brilliantly within its terms as a latter-day version of the humanist Translatio Studi. The entries showcased linguistic difference and untranslatability. And part of it is that you can even see visually and graphically the way synonyms are written or printed, not just in their different languages, but in their different scripts. And so you're actually confronting the languages right away on the page. Peter Osborne, an English editor of Radical Philosophy, whose colleagues at the Journal and in the then Warwick Philosophy Department were originally contracted to do an English edition with Routledge, and Routledge canceled on them, characterized the untranslatable as that which refers to the conceptual differences carried by the differences between languages, not in a pure form, but via the fractured histories of translation through which European philosophies have been constituted. Barbara Cassin, more geopolitically attuned, spoke of a cartography of philosophical differences. Now, in Europe, this book became sort of astonishingly a bestseller. Over 10,000 copies sold, along with the translation rights for adapted versions to Mexico, Morocco, Romania, the Ukraine, Iran, Brazil, Russia, and finally now, because of my series, the US. Garnering attention among academic and mainstream audiences, its reception was a positive surprise, even to the editors. And the vocabulary on this regard might be seen as of a piece with a growing body of contemporary film work on philosophy, including Derek Jarman's Wittgenstein, David Barrison and Daniel Ross's The Ishtar on Heidegger, Kirby Dick and Amy Ziering Kaufman's film on Jacques Derrida, Astra Taylor's Examined Life with cameos from Cornel West, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Judith Butler, Avital Ronell, Peter Singer, and others. And now we have to add Dragan's film on Hillis Miller, The First Sale. My work on the vocabulaire led me to think about a method of work in the humanities that could be described in a way as how to do things with untranslatables. The idea was to philosophize comparative literature by considering literary examples from the perspective of untranslatability. And let me give an example. In his entry to the vocabulary on the Portuguese national trope saudade, often paired with fado, Fernando Santoro gives it the run of languages, disciplines, and metaphysical modalities. And it's broadly taken as a term to mean melancholia. But he really takes it from Plato's theory of the desire for the beautiful through reminiscence of its idea to the transcendence of metaphysics by a return to the pre-Socratic origins of thought. He says the whole history of philosophy can be woven and deconstructed in the shadow of this delectable melancholic passion. This is a painting by an LA artist named Larry Pittman in a show that just finished in New York. And you can see the word saudade, and I'm throwing it up there because it's kind of like a tourist symbol here. And this also shows you that certain kinds of national ideas that may have quite a lot of philosophical freight are also sit in this ambiguous space as kind of national ideas, right? They become almost like tourist products that people come to you for. So it's a very complex phenomenon. It's not just that saudade has this distinguished aesthetic and philosophical history, but it's also associated with music, with a way of life, with Portugueseness, and as you'll see in a second, with an incredibly rich history. You may already be fully conversant with it. But my idea here was to, in a sense, look at what I would call a saudade effect that makes it something that should be a new category of comparative literature that is an untranslatable that transfers nonetheless to different languages and cultures. But it's never been claimed as that, right? Saudade is noted as the kind of Portuguese national character trope, but it hasn't been activated as a critical untranslatable in literary studies. So part of what interested me here was to, in a sense, to explore what Samuel Weber calls the abilities of a term. He takes this term from Walter Benjamin, and the German suffix Barkeit, as in Übersetzbarkeit, translatability, or Reproduzierbarkeit, reproducibility. And in the spirit of this, I would add Unübersetzbarkeit, or untranslatability, the ability of untranslatability. And I was attracted to this whole question of experimenting with the saudade effect in reference to a 1988 novel by the Portuguese writer Antonio Lobo Antunes, titled in Portuguese As Naus, translated in English as The Return of the Caravels. A caravel, whose name derives from an Arabic term, is a small, flexible vessel invented around the time that Portuguese maritime exploits in West Africa and the Atlantic Ocean took off in the 15th and 16th centuries. And it was distinguished by these lateen sails, which made it extremely fast, and the prototype for what became fighting ships known as the Portuguese man-of-war that was deployed to patrol Portugal's trade corridors to Brazil and the East Indies. So the caravel signified the mariner's navigational skill matched to advanced technologies of shipbuilding. And it was such a galleon that was shipwrecked in 1552 and commemorated in de Camões's account of Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in the epic The Lusiads. So it's a kind of modern warcraft machine, which, as Margaret Cohen notes in her recent book, The Novel and the Sea, inspired a genre which she calls craft romance. Long after craft disappeared, she writes, the icons of maritime modernity would return to figure practices at the frontier of capitalist risk. Now, in Antunes's novel, the caravel is no longer just the proto-capitalist transporter of slaves and fetishes, nor is it the contemporary mover of diamonds and petroleum. It emerges as a figure of haunted post-colonial modernity, typified by the retornados, those settler colonials who were dispatched, kicked out by Frelimo, UNITA, and a host of other insurrectional groups that ensured the belated end of Portugal's African empire. The retornado becomes a kind of shadow of his former self when relocated to Portugal, and the caravel in this book stands as a hollowed-out specter of former imperial glory. Seaborne hallucinations bind this vision of a kind of historical anachronism and nostalgia and psychic disorientation to a condition we might call fugue or Wandertrieb or traveler's disease that I think of in relation to the philosopher Ian Hacking's work in Mad Travelers, Reflections on the Reality of Transient Mental Illness. Hacking, one could say, offers the Anglo-analytic correlative, grounded in philosophy of mind and cognitive psychology, to the continental philosophy of Saudade, whose kindred terms in other European languages include Greek negligence or Latin assidia, listlessness, torpor, depression, Latin desiderium, yearning, French nostalgie, German Sehnsucht or longing, Spanish Saudade, loneliness, Finnish Kaiho, involuntary solitude, German Weltschmerz, sorrow of the world, Albanian Mal, sadness mixed with laughter, English spleen, and melancholia in the Freudian sense of a pathological incorporation of the object of mourning. The Turkish correlative huzun should also be added to this list. It's been identified by Orhan Pamuk with a sense of worldly failure, listlessness, and spiritual suffering, with the post-colonial melancholia of Istanbul after the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, and with a cluster of feelings that in Pamuk's writing approximates something almost Proustian. And so this is a kind of endlessly generative term. Now, you might say that while Saudade here risks becoming overly capacious, that didn't come through very clearly, but I guess you can read it. It recuperates specificity in cross-literary contexts. Arthur Rimbaud's Le Bateau Ivre, The Drunken Boat, affords an early case, I would say, of French Saudade, with all the crucial elements: a sea voyage, traveler's disease, and a concatenation of feelings ranging from erotic bliss to blues to mortal bitterness to the desire for transfinitude. I give you the French there, and then here are two different translations. One, a conventional one by Louise, I'm sorry, there should be an E on the end of, it's not Louis, it's Louise Varese. And the second, a very little known translation of this by Samuel Beckett. Now, I'll just bring to your attention, I'm not going to read this, that Beckett translated the poem at an early stage in his career, and actually the manuscript was burned up. There's a kind of facsimile with smoky edges around it that survived. And it was only published years later in 1976, even though he did it in the 1930s. But look at this choice of sky's hemorrhage for rutiment du jour, rendered in Louise Varese as blaze of day, and his curious lexical hybrid, arch alcohol, for plus forte que l'alcool, stronger than alcohol. These were, of course, sharply criticized as examples of aberrant or wrong or bad translation, and for years you couldn't even find this text because it was considered a really, really bad translation that he should have disavowed, and virtually did. But I would say that Beckett was alive to a kind of Saudade effect and wanted to communicate its Rambaldian deregulation of the senses through the practice of what I call translating untranslatably, by which I mean a kind of over-translation that embraces wild infidelity to the original and pushes the envelope of translatability. Identifying Saudade in this way with the full abilities of untranslatability, instead of reserving it for restricted use as the name of a Portuguese term, assigns that a special critical function in comparative literature. It becomes a term, I think, for translation wobble, the difficulty encountered by writers and their translators in rendering passages that express an elusive, affective, and mental cosmos. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to be arguing for untranslatability in the era of a translational turn that I myself helped support. And there are certainly critics who consider such a move to be unconvincing. In his recent book, Is That a Fish in Your Ear? Translation and the Meaning of Everything, the critic and accomplished translator David Bellows insists that nothing is untranslatable. Quote, "The circulation of novels among all the vehicular languages of the world and their incontestable conversations with one another demonstrate without a shadow of doubt," I like that, without a shadow of doubt, "that style does survive translation. In sum, the widespread notion that style is untranslatable is just a variant of the folkish nostrum that a translation is no substitute for the original," end of quote. Bellows treats the idea that certain contents are ineffable or ungraspable to similar skepticism, arguing with clever reverse logic that, quote, "the ineffable is not a problem for translation, but translation is one big problem for the ineffable." That's a very clever statement. Here he's positioning himself against Gerald Katz's Wittgensteinian axiom of ineffability, which states that what cannot be expressed in any human language lies outside the boundaries of translation and outside the field of language too. For Bellows, one of, quote, "the truths that translation teaches us is that everything is effable." In my view, to say that everything is effable implies faith in the limitless capabilities of human rationalist epistemology. It's more a categorical statement about the conditions of optimum cognizability than a disproof of linguistic ineffability or untranslatability. Bellows suggests that translators breach the limit of expression simply by doing what they do, which is to say, by translating. Yes, I would say, translators do make inroads against ineffability, with ingenious discoveries of words for saying the unsaid, and felicitous feats of synonymy. But this does not make translatability the operative rule, or disqualify untranslatability. I would activate the untranslatable not as pure difference, which may be rightly suspect as another form of the romantic absolute or fetish of the other, or myth of hermeneutic inaccessibility, but as a linguistic form of creative failure with homeopathic uses. In a book that I'm completing titled Against World Literature, with a question mark, on the politics of untranslatability, I suggest that a focus on untranslatability counters the reflexive tendency in both translation studies and world literature to endorse cultural equivalence and substitutability, as well as the entrepreneurial, I would even say bulimic drive to anthologize and curricularize the world's cultural resources, not to mention the downsizing of foreign language departments. Because you have world literature, right? You don't need to actually study the languages anymore. Now, I take as an example, this is a really good book, The Routledge Companion to World Literature, which came out a few weeks ago, with a programmatic reach that covers, quote, "the disciplinary relationship of world literature to areas such as philology, translation, globalization, and diaspora studies." And this is an imaginatively conceived and richly synthetic book, but it just zooms over the speed bumps of untranslatability in the rush to cover ground. This and other anthologies like it, in my view, can foreclose the possibility that language can be withholding, that it, especially with regard to the secret of what language itself is. As Daniel Heller-Rosen has suggested, language even can draw attention to this condition of self-non-disclosure because it allows for the existence of secret languages or private languages or jargons within vehicular tongues. These secret idiolects of rogues, that's his phrase in reference to the coquillards, who were a band of Burgundian brigands in the 15th century who invented a kind of secret tongue to mask their criminal activities. It attests to the possibility of untranslatability in language and to the abilities of translation failure. Now, this idea of translation failure was one of Walter Benjamin's obsessions and a concept whose richness has been plumbed by translation studies far less than his famously enigmatic notion of reine Sprache, or pure or transparent language. And it invites elaboration alongside other iterations of the non-translatable: aletheia, hidden being; glossolalia, or speaking in tongues; technical jargons; anagrammatic cipher; das Unverständlich, the ununderstandable; or Wittgenstein's notions of das Unaussprechliche, the inexpressible, das Unsachbare, the unsayable, the unspeakable. And you recall the famous proposition from the Tractatus, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Each of these terms affords a heuristic for a field that might be called untranslatability studies. Such a field also takes its cue from the structure of translational interdiction in theology and religion. Bans on the portage of words from one language to another acquire a particular force in the injunction, for example, issued by the Moroccan writer Quilito, "Thou shalt not translate me." His fables of translational impropriety add density to efforts by Jacques Derrida in his Theologies of Translation essay, Naomi Seidman in her book Faithful Renderings, Samuel Weber in the book on Benjamin's abilities, and Saba Mahmoud's Politics of Piety, to rethink secular criticism in terms of the bounds of sacrosanction, the right to translation and non-translation, or, in most general terms, a theology of translation. Now, while I realize that treating a term as off-limits to translation risks sacralizing its irreducible singularity and potentially walling it off in non-coevalness, in other words, it's the other, it's impossible to relate to because it's in its own place, it's the absolute other. These risks, it seems to me, may be worth taking if they afford a better grasp of what is at stake ethically and politically when an idea or work of literature or word resists linguistic transference. One of the founders of comparative literature, Erich Auerbach, had a keen sense of such stakes. An assimilated Jew, fired from his job in Marburg because of the Nuremberg laws, he fled to Istanbul in 1936 and spent 11 years teaching there. He was brought to the University of Istanbul by his friend Leo Spitzer, and though he arrived just as Spitzer was preparing to leave for Johns Hopkins, this was in 1936, they collaborated on devising a Romance philology curriculum and published a series of seminar papers that included contributions on and in multiple languages, including Turkish. As I've written in my book, Auerbach was very aware that he had been brought in to, in a sense, annihilate a university tradition that was in Persian, and he was part of these radical reforms to modernize the university system and to introduce European-style education. But he said, and the famous quote is, "I've gone from one primal nationalism to another," and I have this citation up where he mentioned something quite interesting. He uses this term. It has quickly gone fantastical and ghostly. He's talking about the Turkish nationalist state. Already there is hardly anyone who can understand Arabic or Persian, and even Turkish texts of the past century will quickly become ununderstandable, unverständlich, since the language is being simultaneously modernized and newly oriented on Ur-Turkish and written with Latin characters. Now, as Robert Stein, the translator of this letter, notes, quote, "The real loss of history in this project that claims to draw all its energies from history, the substitution of concrete historical development by its ghost, is already at the center of Auerbach's perception, and he sees it in terms of a crisis in language that materially disconnects the present from the past. End of quote. The temporal disjunction between linguistic past and present manifests itself as untranslatability, or more exactly, a distinct kind of untranslatability, qualified in the letter as unverständlich, or the ununderstandable. This is untranslatability, defined not so much in terms of mistranslation or failure to communicate, but as a wedge of opacity in verstehen, in understanding, perceptible at historical moments of political upheaval. Little wonder, then, that the project undertaken by Auerbach in Istanbul, his foundational mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, made the ununderstandable an operative principle. The book was hailed as a model of comparative literature at a time when the discipline was still in its infancy, at least in America. But Auerbach's attentiveness to the untranslatability of cultural expression, to the loss of language under conditions of regime change or cultural usurpation, and to discrepant literary traditions, actually downplayed the equivalencies and similitudes so dear to comparatists. The field he helped forge is better labeled, as James Porter would have it, in comparative literature. Auerbach helps make sense of why we might want to constitute in comparative literature. It's a practice of comparative literature that attends to the decimation of semantic complicities which cement a polity or group subject. Edward Said was very keenly aware of this kind of work, this kind of practice, this philology of political fracture, extending it to what I call his terrestrial humanism. War, revolution, civil disorder, abrogated citizenship, deportation, exile, extraordinary rendition, and the negative fallout of globalization, these violent events for Said translate as incomprehension within and across languages. For Said, Auerbach's notion of earthly reality, irdish, introduced in the early figural study of Dante's Divine Comedy, registers this unheimlich, unverständlich, this uncanny, ununderstandable dimension of what a world is. Reckoning with politics on the ground as earthly injustice, as catastrophe, al-Nachba, what becomes part of what it means to be truly inside comparative literature. But what kind of curriculum might this suggest? Former colleague of mine from UCLA, Ken Reinhard, he circulated this course description called What is a World? It highlights questions that call for philosophy's reaffirmation in theories of world, particularly as they anchor the concept and practice of world literature, although that's not really his focus here. I won't read it all, but he says, is a world an interior with a border that marks its difference from an exterior? Is a world constituted by the various perspectives of the individuals who inhabit it? Or is there something transcendental in a world, invariant and resistant to even constitutive of multiple perspectives? How does a world emerge? Suddenly, like the Big Bang or the biblical creation story, or through gradual development, like geological accretion? And how does a world change? Through internal development or external pressures, through evolutionary modification or revolutionary rupture. Reinhardt's course was uncannily complementary to the one that I'm going to be giving this spring. And this was my course description I just designed, and it's called The World Literature Debates. And you can see I mentioned this prehistory of Weltliteratur since Goethe, and this is kept up, and the different efforts to revive the idea of world literature that has kept up pressure to work non-Eurocentrically, but also led to macro approaches that promote very superstructural readings. And I propose to look at some of the problems that arise when doing world literature, its ready promotion of identifying over differing, without essentializing irreducible difference or cultural untranslatability. We will experiment with theories of world that open up world literature toward philosophy. And then I pose my own set of questions. How do theories of cosmos, planetarity, world depression, or dysphoria Manichaean Kulturkampf, and the premonition of earthly extinction, Ray Brassier's Nihil Unbound, redefine the literary field. So this is a kind of place I'm kind of crazily going towards with untranslatability. Without necessarily taking on the full complement, I'm getting towards the end here, while not taking on the full complement of phenomenological philosophies of world that lead inexorably to Heidegger's abandoned structures of indwelling, where metaphysics runs aground, there are, I will argue, phenomenological and ontotheological interrogations of the globe and globalization that philosophically complicate the idea of world literature. And here I've been thinking also about Jean-Luc Nancy's book, The Creation of the World or Globalization, which examines manifold differences between globalization, the crushing unitotality of the network society, and what he calls mondialisation, a creative world forming, not to mention more subtle distinctions between the English globalization and the French globalisation, which are not the same, at least in his view. Nancy casts the philosophy of world as a translation problem. Taking his cue from Barbara Cassin's vocabulaire, he defers to an untranslatable mondialisation in his preface to the English edition of the book. And I won't read all of this. I'm just sort of signaling it along the way. He projects a theory of world-making that puts into discussion or conversation the orbis of the planet, the urbs of the city, and the globe as a kind of geometric icon, and its dark twin, glomus, associated with what he evokes as the techno-scientific nightmare of population explosion and the dissipation of the certainties, images, and identities of what the world was with its parts and humanity. On the trail of a kind of worldhood that enjoys itself through the effervescence of its thought and act and through its creation of forms and signs, Nancy projects a non-sovereign multiplicity of worlds that disavows the conventional alignment of planetary law with unequal territorial distribution, cosmos nomos. Here we could say he approaches Peter Zendi's nomos of the sensible, characterized by the aesthetic repartition of the world's material forms. Finally, one could even compare Nancy's philosophical worlding with Gayatri Spivak's notion of planetarity, set apart from notions of the planetary, the planet, the earth, the world, the globe, globalization, and the like. Associated with this, and in the vocabulary I asked her to add a little entry on her notion, her very fixed and marked notion of planetarity. Associated, quote, with a species of alterity belonging to a system that we inhabit on loan, planetarity for Spivak refuses a custodial model of sustainability that, quote, keeps geology safe for good imperialism and, quote, emphasizes capital's social productivity, but not its subalternizing tendency, end of quote. In these interrogations of the cosmopolitical, cosmological, and philosophical dimensions of world, all wheels are turning and no point of orientation is consistently privileged. So you have a kind of, if you look at this theory, a kind of philosophical world making that ranges with each different name carrying something special. Mondialité, worldness for Nancy, philosophizing in languages for Barbara Cassin, planetarity for Spivak, tout-mondisme for Glissant. All these in each of these cases, the key concept of monde is an untranslatable. And here I just throw something. This is the Chilean French painter Mata, who did this wonderful painting called Monde, M''OND, where it's almost like my world. There's the trace of the first person, the marker of the me, the sense of a wave, of a kind of chaos or chaos world. Made me think of Glissant, so it's just a sort of visual kind of sideline. In problematizing the term world in world literature, and here's my conclusion, part of my intention has been to work against the temptation to allegorize world system or the planet or capital, and these tend to kind of impute subjective personalities to political entities and geographic phantasms, as if placing them like sovereign avatars in a cosmic space frame of a video game, or turning them into epic characters subject to pathetic fallacy. So if you talk planet or globe, this kind of, to me, a kind of video game. But I'll conclude by suggesting that nonetheless it might be useful, it is useful to rethink world literature in terms of what I'm calling planetary dysphoria, a depressive position suffusing every aspect of economic and social life. And Bonnie started with a kind of depressing prologue, and I'm going to end on a really depressing note here. Dysphoria, from the Greek, meaning to bear, that which is difficult, denotes an unpleasant or uncomfortable mood. Sadness, a downer moment, anxiety, restlessness, irritability, spleen, manic swings, withdrawal, and the total evacuation of euphoria. It is an untranslatable that doubles as a call to action. For world literature to understand and transform an economy contoured more and more by a recessionary drive and by subjects of melancholia. Melancholia is dysphoria at the scale of the subject, a condition defined by Freud as, quote, a profoundly painful dejection, cessation of interest in the outside world, loss of the capacity to love, inhibition of all activity, and a lowering of the self-regarding feelings to a degree that finds utterance in self-reproaches and self-revilings and culminates in a delusional expectation of punishment. It sounds like the humanities. Now, the film critic A.O. Scott quoted this passage when reviewing Lars von Trier's new movie, Melancholia, whose title refers to the name of a rogue planet that crashes into Earth and whose glowering approach on the horizon tugs at the latent suicidal inclinations of people in depression. The characters in the film go mute as they become transfixed by what is happening in the sky. It is this, in a sense, becoming mute of cosmic untranslatability that I'm currently inspired to think about in imagining new parameters for in-comparative literature. Thank you. Sure.
So if anybody has questions, we'll ask that you stand up and speak up.
I talk for a long time. People may be very tired, but...
Yes.
Just building on the last comment.
Yes.
What if you were to think of it instead of floating away the work of mourning within it? How would it affect our conclusion which you just made?
Well, I think, that's a complex and wonderful question that goes back to Freud. What's the relationship between mourning versus melancholia? That melancholia is the sort of pathological version of mourning. Instead of working through, you just hold on to it, right? And I would say that, in a way that someone like Said, I wouldn't call him melancholic. I would call him more a mourning. It's a figure more of mourning, of working through these violent events that are recorded within language that leave their loss. But it isn't so much to do with a kind of pathological incorporation. It's more to do with a kind of desire to see a revolutionary change or to make something out of that that fact of language loss or eradication, and to constantly call attention to it. But it's not, to me, the same kind of condition as I see us in now, where and it obviously depends on where we're talking about. I mean, you could say in a sense that Arab Spring is an answer to Said, right? Then that's one trajectory for this. Where will that take us? What kind of, will there be a sort of pushback and a reclaiming of earthly just distribution of a whole question around the ability to think critically in the humanities and claim a space for it and an economy for it, and to say that because it doesn't have a useful outcome, it has a kind of revolutionary potential. Whereas with the Melancholia, which is more in the phase of the moon I'm in now, I think, we have to accept that it's going to be more of a condition of huzun, of nostalgia, of holding on to something. But we're in the balance in a way. So I appreciate your question, because I feel like it helps define two modalities that are going on in both the history of the discipline of comparative literature, which I think have always been, in a sense, uniquely marked by these two kinds of emotion, by exile that has led either to, in a sense, the path of melancholia or the path of mourning.
I understood your use of untranslatability or untranslatable as being itself a translation of comparative, creative translation, through which you both keep the equivalence and the difference of the singularity and what can also be comparable to the self. Now, my question is, Benjamin, for example, when he talks about translation, also mentions something that maybe one thinks little about, the fact that the translator is confronted to his own lack, right? That is, that the translator feels that his own mother tongue that he's supposed to master is lacking, or that he's not in control of it. So I'm wondering, since your talk was also political or having a political emphasis, do you think that one of the reasons why there is comparative literature at risk, or the humanities at risk, is because of this sort of turn to the self that is found lacking, and this is something that the powers that be wouldn't want us to feel or to realize or to come to terms with?
Yeah. I think it's a strange thing, because the history of scientific discovery and breakthrough is always the history of the failures that led up to it. But it has a kind of triumphalist narrative that in the end you hit on the right thing through trial and error, or through accepting. So it's not this kind of, it's a very different purposing of failure. In the humanities, I think it's more of a, almost a private theology. You know, with Benjamin, he first of all really wanted to compete with Stefan George and translate the Baudelaire in a very different way, better than he did, and nobody went along with it. As far as I know, nobody has hailed Benjamin's translations of Baudelaire in German as somehow, superior. So, and then there was the story of he spent a long time translating Proust, and some of it was serialized, but the bulk of it was lost, and it's never been found. And he writes about this, with this tremendous sense that for someone who was so obsessed with his library and carrying, in a sense, the world of books with him wherever he went, physically and in his head and in his notebooks, that there's a kind of pathos to failure in Benjamin, which I think most of the major figures in the 20th century in comparative literature and deconstruction theory, they all are sort of marked by this. And they don't see any problem with it. They don't have to apologize for it. It's not a moral failing. It's not something. It's something deeply powerful, if difficult. It's a difficulty of being and of understanding complexities that's what life is about. So I wouldn't even call it too much turning to the self. That's almost a 19th century solipsistic understanding of, the aesthete. I don't think it's quite the same thing. I think it's more precisely an understanding you are never at home in a language, that nations that claim national languages have their distinct political histories, and you can't generalize about it, but that those linguistic nationalisms can lead to blood, to death, to all kinds of unbelievable conflicts and wars, and that we're talking about thinkers who never really embraced the national tongue as an identity. You know, that's some kind of underlying common thing. And I think many people who find themselves, for one reason or another, in comparative literature, understand that, even if they don't articulate it. It's like, that's it, yeah, that's that condition, sure. And some of the most important thinking comes out of that place of dis-ease, of not belonging, of understanding, of hitting that incredibly frightening abyss of the untranslatability within language as such, which Paul de Man was so alive to. So I think I would answer that way, that it's not being valued in the same way, that there's the trial and error failure on the way to the great discovery, which is valued. But, you know, we're in an era of provable outcomes. I do think the humanities has to do a better job articulating why that would be important. And I think it's possible to do. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that in talking about, thinking about the untranslatable, you seem to draw inspiration from other means of media, like film, probably like visual arts, I'm wondering to what degree these other kinds of aesthetic media enter into the conversation about what can and cannot be translated, what is not, what those other ways of knowing that we should be trying.
Yeah, you're raising the question of translation or non-translation across media, which is something I'm deeply interested in. And but one of the reasons I'm always a little hesitant to take the leap and generalize about it too much is because I think once you get into cross-medial translation, you're using translation in a more metaphorical sense than you are in a linguistic and literary sense. It's not that you can't, but that there's a big shift that happens there, which is why I like to use it more as almost a prompt or as a suggestion, at least in this case. But I also think that there's, in the humanities and in the visual arts as well, something I wrote about once called lectiocentrism. Everything is to do with the reading of. You read an image, you read a film, you do a reading of it. And I thought, well, what would it be like? To me, in a case of untranslatability would be the looking or the listening, right? Let's do a listening of a book. Let's do a looking of a film. And I think that would make people sit up and say, well, what do you mean? I mean, I in fact I have a graduate student who finished a dissertation recently. He went to the Congo and he learned Lingala, and he was a very gifted musician, and he went to do a francophone dissertation and ended up playing in bands and and he said there's something incredible going on. He said the groups have no money, and so they can only afford to rehearse once, but the standards of the audience in the clubs is so high that they can't afford to mess up, so they have to literally memorize vast quantities of music, lyrics, not just musical riffs, but lyrics on one round. It's like a kind of almost a complete photographic recording. And for him, this wasn't, he went looking for the reading and came back with the listening as this extremely powerful aesthetic mode that no literary criticism had words to talk about. Well, to me, that's really thinking creatively about a kind of medial untranslatability, right? It's to actually push on that. Yes?
I'm trying to say, because before this, we have a little group, we're trying to find out, okay, after the presentation, what can we get from it? And from your presentation, I have this feeling that you are an expert in translation and you have skills. Now, what are the skills you think a translator can have? Somebody said life itself is constantly being translated by all of us living things. And I was going to pose to you as a translator of text. If you were going to look at the university as it is presently, as a text, what kind of translation and what reading would you give the rest of us of the university as a text? What would be your reading and how would you be reading it? And what would be, what conventions would you be bringing to that kind of reading?
Well, I'll answer briefly two things. One, I spoke at lunch, and I won't repeat it today because a number of you were there, but it was to do with bringing the languages of the world into the classroom so that you hear the languages, so that you see them on the page in their non-translated form, because I really think that direct encounter with languages is something palpable. It actually has a kind of it's different from just reading through everything made easily accessible through translation. So even though I'm not against translation, obviously, I think that there's a way of teaching that takes on what translators encounter in a very concrete way. The other is that I gave a seminar 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, called the Seminar on the Seminar. And that was my reading of the university. And I sat there in front of a group of students and I said, I've been doing this for over 20 years. It's a very weird thing what we're doing. What are we doing? We're having this thing called a seminar, but do we ever reflect on what it is? What is this term? And we went back to the origins of the term in the seminarium. It means also, seed. And in France, it has this whole tradition of the pipeline of feeding promising people into the pépinière, into the elite, right? And it's a very fascinating theatrical thing. But in fact, there is no there. The seminar is a very bizarre form. It's a form of performance art. There is no thing that is the seminar. It's a happening. And my reading of the university and that is very linked actually to some of Derrida's writings about the seminar, is that he has an intense sense, even as he's writing about teaching and as of the actuality of the moment. And if you look through his writings, there's often a record of something. Here I am, standing in this place and speaking to you. I'm not just speaking at you from some offshore, off-site position as the knowledge conveyor. I am in a situation. I am performing something, and we don't know where it's going. We don't know where the outcome is because people's minds wander, they don't hear right, they misunderstand you because they think they want to hear something that you're not saying. And it's actually, and that's what also some of the great theorists of psychoanalysis were so aware of, was the whole role of mishearing, or of hearing what you want to hear, or of the almost a kind of like a theological or religious space that happens, right? Because of course the university is from the monastic tradition. So there's this link to the Word of God, of truth, of disseminating something, but no one can say what it is. You can measure results on a test if you want, but very often the thing that is teaching itself is an act of translating. It's an act of seizing something and making it as you go along. It's very improvisational. It's very impromptu. And I always go in thinking I'm going to be teaching this, and I come out thinking, what happened there? That wasn't what I expected to happen, but that's a great thing. So it's this kind of process where translation used a bit loosely here, but I think, for me, that class on the seminar when the registrar came back and said, your title is a mistake. And I said, no, my title is not a mistake. It is on the seminar as a phenomenon. And also as a form of, I was looking also historically at it was a fascinating thing in the history of colonialism, the teaching that was exported to places. What happens when that happens? And then people come back to, say, metropolitan areas and are reschooled. Or what happens when the whole wave of theory in America happened because of something that didn't exist in France. We invented this thing called a theory seminar. There's nothing like that in France. If you say a theory seminar to French people, they look at you like you're crazy. There was never a theory seminar. We invented it in emulation and projection of something. So I love that kind of transatlantic process where one thing is projected and it has this relay effect. And that's also what translation very much is that constant fracturing and it comes back. It's this recursive thing that has nothing at all to do with what was sent out.
Last one, because once we said that,
Yeah.
then the next thing that came up was, is translation and interpretation, are they cousins, are they related? What I heard you say now looks like an interpretation of university as a text and what it means to. And every time anybody in the group said translation, we said, are you sure you're not talking about interpretation? What's the...
Well, they're very close, you know. The question of translation historically, and that would be another lecture, and for specialists who know much more about this than I do, probably many in this room, but I would think it is very fascinating to take the whole history of translation through translations of holy texts, of scripture. And it's very linked to that, and to various schools of how to do that, whether you're doing a gloss, whether it's an explanation for proselytizing purposes or for bringing one language, making it more accessible to more people, or whether it's a form of inner circle contemplation and worrying in a Kabbalistic or Torah-like tradition or Quranic tradition where there's a lot of repetition, a lot of study of etymologies and where does the sacred word come from. So the whole question of explication, interpretation is so bound up with the history of translation that historically that's never ever gone away. If anything, I think I'm coming back to that as another extremely important part of its history that should be thought about again in different contexts. Sure.
This brings me to thinking about the idea of the day which I studied chemistry.
Yes.
It gives me a flavor of metaphysics of the present strain. You talk about this. You don't want to do that. How can you avoid it?
I don't know if I don't want to do that anymore. I think there might be, I find myself interested in the possibility of a theory of transfinitude that would be classically housed under the metaphysics. Now, presence in the sense of, a full universal, I don't know. But I am much more interested now in the effects of translatability in relation to a desire for transport across the line of death.
I guess my question is not about it creates the impression as if there's something which cannot be translated. That's why I have difficulty for that.
Well, that's why I've had all those sort of caveats and provisos about I don't want to resurrect the romantic absolute or the ineffable and such. But I think I'm somewhere in between. In other words, I don't think I'm prepared to... There is something, I think, that is to do with the secrets within language, or I'm not sure I would call it the metaphysics of presence, but that constantly, and it may not be pure difference, but whether it's differing or whether it's something much more pragmatic, which is what always remains out of grasp, or that we know about, but it's not taken on board sufficiently in how we teach or think about comparative literature, because everything is structured in comparative literature traditionally around the basis of similarity, of finding an identity from one culture to another. So part of my reaction is that we talk all the time about celebrating differences and diversities and respecting the other, but in fact the teaching goes again is all about finding commonality. Well, if the alternative is to say, well, you're different and you're walled into that, no, that's not what I'm arguing, but I do think that there is something that it's not just respect for difference, it's actually trying to give it a place in how we redefine literary studies. That is a harder challenge.
Okay, I was just wondering, where would you go next with your construct of untranslatability? Because usually it sort of implies variety, magnitude of possibilities, infinity, but that's not always the case in reality, because if you think about Nabokov or about Pivia and Volokhonsky, first of all, they establish that certain scenes are untranslatable, and we all know about Nabokov's concept of Vorschlist, which is impossible to translate in any other language. But then he turned into this authoritarian dictator because he said that I am the only one who can translate or who can somehow come up with the approximation. And speaking about Pivia and Volokhonsky, now all Russian writers, Gogol, Pasternak, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Bulgakov, you name it, they all speak one language. That is the language of Richard Pivia.
Yes.
But they started by saying that, look, there are so many untranslatable scenes in Tolstoy, and all those wonderful idioms in Dostoevsky are almost impossible to translate. And then they ended up with this totalitarian project. All those writers, they are almost indistinguishable. They now speak one simple language with some horrible words like iftoodlessness, supposedly used by Pasternak. He never used that word, but they just wanted to make it foreign. They wanted it to look strange. They wanted to sound like Pasternak. But he never.
Well, I think
said
someone like
words.
David Bellows says that you just have to keep trying, and if it sounds strange, but eventually you'll get to some equivalent and you'll translate it. And I'm saying you have to accept this condition and somehow walk around it, allude to it, make it in a footnote, perhaps, something that. But I agree that that it's not so much that you're going to get rid of untranslatability. You're not. But the question is, how do you teach with it in mind? It seems to me, those are two. You're not going to get rid of it.
What I meant that it often translates into a totalitarian project. That all the diversity and multiple possibilities are somehow being eliminated in the end, and that's what I really wanted to answer.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a bit earlier today about the wars around the Freud translations. There have been a whole school of Penguin translators that said we do not want to use a standard vocabulary for Freud. He doesn't really use it, and the terms that the Strachey team employed are, they're Latin, Greek terms that were not in Freud's German, and instead of standardizing and having a standard edition, and what you're talking about is, in a sense, a standard, consistent Tolstoy in English, or, a standard, consistent Proust. There was also a whole team of different translators doing Proust, as opposed to having one translator do Proust. This is, in some ways, a new movement in translation studies that is much more open to a kind of less, monolithic approach to translation, where before consistency was understood to be a value. So.
Actually, it's not really a question. I enjoyed your talk very much. At lunchtime, I actually always trained as a comparativist, so I have a lot of appreciation for comparativism. The one thing I noticed in the Auerbach quote that you put up there was, here's Auerbach, he's in Turkey, and he's seeing that they're going Western, and it feels good for him because he has a good job. But the one thing about comparative literature that I found troublesome myself, I still struggle with it sometimes, is the incapacity. I mean, like even Said, when he did Orientalism, he was actually looking at the philological roots of comparative literature. So he goes back to Renan, he looks at the philology. So the problem there, of course, is that, with these philologists, they're looking for God. Now when you come into, we are kind of doomed to be secular. So at the same time that we don't have that, we don't have God in the same way that we would have had in the 19th century, let's say. And so I think that kind of that untranslatability is just wonderful because of that. But it also kind of shows that there's a kind of incapacity. In other words, we're meeting another, which is just as strong as we are, whether or not. In the 19th century, you could say, I've got God, you don't. And I'm going to go into, but I'm in Chinese studies. That's how sinology was formed, because the philologists just say this, get out of here. China doesn't have God, so we're going to do sinology. It didn't stop being a problem, but what I'm saying is that now, we're kind of on equal footing, if you will. So part of the untranslatability is the fact that I cannot impose a translation on you.
Well, I think literature was always considered the secular version of religion, and I mean, Said says this.
Said says that Renan is secular. I mean, that's nonsense. I mean, that's his project. He's kind of
No, but I think that's a truism. That's a commonplace. That's not sort of that. And so when you talk in these general terms about the 19th century philologists en bloc thought they were looking for God, I think not necessarily. I think they were.
Not Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Not Nietzsche, for sure. Of course, but he was looking for the depth of God. I mean, that's the same
But he
thing.
was claimed to be a philologist,
Yeah.
He was, absolutely.
for example.
But no, I mean, I think that's. It gets into questions around how you interpret Babel too, which is a biblical story,
Well,
and.
suppose what I'm talking about is that it's an institution.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're talking about, let's say, melancholia within comparative literature or within humanities, aside from the funding issues, I'm talking about this kind of more abstract sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the sense that now the playing field is changing dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And so that other that we could once translate with a certain amount of security or feeling of authority, that other is not there anymore. The other is doing it themselves. And I think that that's a really important aspect. That the comparative, as I said, I was trained as a comparativist, but one thing I found was that there was this moment where you say, well, you're going to have to admit it, man.
But when you say the others translating themselves, I'm not sure I follow.
Well, I come from Chinese studies, so, for example, sinology grows out of phonology, philology. It breaks off from philology. Why? Philology is basically, the philologists are going back to Eden. When you go into certain cultures, they could not find the roots. So sure, they could go into India and say Sanskrit is there. But when you went into certain language groups, that was lacking, right? You couldn't go there. You could not use that same, whatever you want to call it, model, or that same stream of language would have you. It didn't work there. And so you had to find another model. And so I think that part of this untranslatability is incapacity. That's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's an institutional incapacity.
Yeah, but I'm not convinced that, in fact, I think philology is more interesting than ever for untranslatability studies. So anyway, I'll end there.